everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few moments. Welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few moments. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Shady Rose, and I'm so glad to welcome you to our event featuring Michael Kaufman, The Last Exit, and our guest Keith Parsons of the DC Poetry Collective. You're tuning in because you thought this book was interesting. You saw it on our shelves, you saw it on our social media. Now we get to talk about it. I'm so excited. For those of you who are brand new to our events, we are Lost City Books, an independent bookstore in the heart of Adams Morgan. Some of you may recognize the shelves you see in our little video here. We specialize in used, new, and rare books, and our space generates engagement and enrichment from the surrounding community, inviting artists, activists, organizers, authors, of course, and educators, many of which are reflected in our staff from the area to share their knowledge and skills. Again, my name is Shady Rose, and I welcome you. I'm so glad to be here tonight. Let's talk a little bit about who we've got joining us tonight. First up is our author, Michael Kaufman, PhD, who is a writer of both fiction and nonfiction books. As an advisor, activist, and keynote speaker, he has developed innovative approaches to engage men and boys in promoting gender equality and positively transforming men's lives. Very, very good work there. Over the past 4 decades, his work with the United Nations, governments, non-governmental organizations, corporations, trade unions, and universities has taken him to 50 countries. Michael is the co-founder of the White Ribbon Campaign, the largest effort in the world of men working to end violence against women. He volunteers as a senior fellow at Promundo, Washington, D.C., and co-wrote its first State of the World's Fathers report. He advised to the French government in 2019 and the Canadian government in 2018 as a member of their respective G7 Gender Equality Advisory Councils. In 2017, he was awarded Canada's Meritorious Service Cross. Keith David Parsons, who you may remember from our event for Ink Blots Volume 1 from the DC Poetry Collective, is a native of West Virginia, living in Washington, D.C., and less conflicted about it than you might think. This is one of my favorite bios to read. He believes a poem without a message is like a big hole without spikes at the bottom. Why would you dig it? And a little bit about The Last Exit, which we're here to talk about today. The Last Exit is set in Washington, D.C., 20 years from now. Climate change has hit hard, fires are burning, unemployment is high, and controversial longevity treatments are only available to the very rich. Sounds quite like the trajectory we're already on, doesn't it? Enter resourceful young police detective Jen B. Liu and her partner, Chandler, a SIM implant in her brain and her instant link to the internet and police records, and a constant voice inside her head. He's an inquisitive, tough guy with a hell of a sense of humor and his own ideas about solving crimes. All right, I'm really excited to talk about this book today, especially as I mentioned to Michael before we began that it's pretty much the exact type of cocktail that I love in a book. So let's go ahead and get started. Without further ado, I'll stop sharing. And hello, Michael, nice to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I wish I'd made a cocktail. I just have this glass of water after this cocktail line.
You know, hopefully some of our viewers at home are enjoying a nice cocktail.
Yes.
And Keith, good to see you as well.
Yeah, I held off on the cocktail because I wanted to be sharp and incisive for this event, but afterwards, definitely. And thanks for having me, Shady, and it's great to meet you, Michael, and I can't wait to talk about the book. It was fantastic.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in a little bit here. I'd love to talk a bit about knowing, Michael, that you write both fiction and nonfiction. I'd like to talk about sort of what some of your nonfiction is like and how it relates to the fiction that we're here to talk about today.
Well, a lot of my nonfiction is about the work I've been doing over the past 30, 40 years now. I started in kindergarten. I mean, I just be clear on this. No, it work focused on promoting women's rights, but specifically engaging men to support those rights. And as part of that, it also means transforming in positive ways the lives of men. And of course, that work is done in an intersectional framework, understanding the complexities, the differences, the different power dynamics among and within different groups of women and men and between us and those who don't define themselves within that gender binary. So my work, and I guess in a way, all of the work that I do, I approach as a change maker, as an activist, but also, I guess, going back to one of those great quotes from the 19-teens, if you can't dance to it, it's not my idea of my type of revolution. I think that really points to why I also just love writing fiction. And more and more, I think that's where I'm heading. Most of what I read is fiction. I'm drawn to storytelling. Many years ago, Shady, I remember when I was first giving a talk on gender equality issues decades ago. I got invited back to speak at a university where I'd spoken the year before. And I was, university based at the time. I was a professor, and this school invited me back. So I was thinking in those terms, and they invited me back. So I said to them, what themes would you like me to talk about again? And they said, themes, tell the story about, blah, 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 blah. And I realized, I thought about how much learning and thinking and processing we do through storytelling. And so, I don't want to, because I have the ability or the privilege of also writing nonfiction, I don't feel I have to turn my fiction into a textbook. I don't want anyone to read The Last Exit and say, well, I really learned a lot, or it was hard work, but I got something out of it. I want people to read The Last Exit and say, wow, that was so much fun. It was a page turner. It was entertaining. It made me laugh. It made me shudder, all those different things. But at the same time, and I totally agree with Keith's wonderful, the quote from Keith in his introduction. I want, we live in this world that is so damn troubled and scary. And yes, on one level, The Last Exit, like any, fun fiction and good fiction, hopefully good, allows us some respite from that, some escape from that, some possibility to dream of an alternative or set of alternatives. But at the same time, I want it embedded in the challenges, the realities, the issues, the problems that you and I face today. So for me, the link isn't so much, the specifics of, linking this theme to that, character in the book or something, but to make sure that the world that Jen Liu inhabits is a world in many ways much like our own, although it is set, 12 years in the future. But I didn't want, I'll tell you what I didn't want to do in this book. I did not want to write another miserable dystopian novel, with, just sort of fog everywhere and neon blinking down into puddles and, or just, total climate collapse or post-nuclear war. I mean, those are, some of those are fine. Some are incredible books and some are incredibly well written. Some are to instigate change. You think of someone like Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale. But, just this sort of deadening impact of just, you're going to be crushed. I'm not interested. I'm not interested, not because I'm naive, I don't think. I mean, we've got existential challenges facing us, and that's not hyperbole to say that. But at the same time, if we think we're going to be crushed, and if we're raising our children with the sense we're going to be crushed, we don't have a chance. And so I wanted to write a book that was fun, was entertaining, was a mystery. At the same time, it not just engaged in themes or pointed to themes, but really had a sense of we can build alternatives. We can find ways to reconstruct our lives and our planet and our communities in ways that will benefit us all.
Michael, I think that's a great point, and I really liked that about the book. The fact that it was sort of a world where everything had not gotten entirely wrong, while there were obviously many big challenges that are some of the same challenges that we face today. And like I noticed that a lot of things sound pretty good, and maybe I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but like in your world, there's been police reform. There's I don't know if there's gender equality, but there's people who are married in triple marriages, gender identifying as they wish. There are a lot of things that seem very progressive, but there are, of course, the major challenges in the book, among them climate change and the inequality in the distribution of the age treatments that were mentioned in the summary. Yeah. Why did you choose the particular challenges that you chose to focus on, as opposed to other things where it's like, we fixed the police. They had a lot of great training, and now they're pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, let's do the police one first, because I think that was the first challenge. I recently wrote an article that looked at just the challenge of writing police procedurals or any mysteries that involve the police in the era of Black Lives Matter, in an era where the ongoing focus, as it should be, is around just the ongoing nature of police brutality beyond the individual, but just seeing it as understanding it as a systemic issue. I remember a number of years ago, one of the many areas of training I did was did some training on gender equality and responding to domestic violence and internal issues of sexual harassment in some police forces. And it's so interesting to, the number of cops that would come up to me afterwards in any of these trainings and start talking about some of their colleagues, and just these cops, they're intimidating to me, and they would start talking about how scared they are of crossing that, thin blue line, criticizing, speaking out. So, for me, it's not about sensitivity training. That's not where it starts. It starts with social movements. And so the way that I decided to address this in the book wasn't just that suddenly, we had peace and love, and everyone saw the error of their ways, and suddenly, the deeply embedded racism of policing and police forces and police practices and the legal codes was suddenly going to disappear in the next 12 years. So what I inserted as part of the backstory, was an uprising in D.C. The book doesn't say it's happened in Minneapolis or other places yet, but in D.C. anyway, in the mid-20s, in the backstory, there's an uprising that actually includes some members of the police force, and it's an uprising that involves both civil society, civil rights activists, trade unionists, and it's obviously I wrote this before the big public explosion a year ago of Black Lives Matter. But the idea was, if I was going to have this sort of positive things that these cops are going to be doing, I wanted to make sure that they were doing it in the context of a very transformed police force. It's, I'm not pretending in it that it's, they've somehow just, the past has disappeared for them. There's still some nasty characters in it, and there's some nasty practices. But I also just, I want to sort of at least have that one with a little sense of moving forward. That may be the most fantastical element of the whole book. That in the flying saucer. Oh, no, there's no flying saucers in this. It's only 12 years in the future. But then in the other things, I mean, let's face it, climate change is going to be not only with us, but it's going to be, the impact is going to be worse in 12 years. Income inequality and social inequality, the way we're going, it's hard to imagine that's not going to be worse than it is now. So those are the sort of two of the biggies that I want to focus on in terms of the present day story. You can't do everything in a book. The sequel, which I've been working on, gets into some other issues, including violence against women. But in this one, I really want to have, it's not about climate change. It's just, this is the world that she lives in. In fact, let me tell you something funny. When I've done some media interviews about the book, people would say, so, did you write this like, the beginning of 2020 or something? And, as if somehow you can write a book and get it edited and published within, anyway, it doesn't work that way, I said. I wrote it in 2018, 2019, and there is a virus that is striking a lot of people. There is this predecessor to this Black Lives Matter. There are forest fires that are, the book starts with a scene where a forest fire from the Shenandoahs the smoke is wafting through DC, just like we saw in California in Oregon over the past year. And but here's how things changed. So I'll read an excerpt later, and I can't remember if it's in that excerpt. But there's a scene right near the beginning where my detective Jen Liu, who's been temporarily demoted to walking the beat, she's in wearing uniform blues, so she's got a mask on because this blaze, the smoke is still coming into DC. So in the original, when I wrote it in 2019, I said, and Jen put on her N95, and I just wrote it that way. As I was editing it later the end of 2019, I thought, who the hell's going to know what an N95 is? So I had to rewrite it to make it clear that this was a type of mask. And of course, anyway, by the time it came, we all know what an N95 is. But yeah, those are the issues I thought, let's focus on those.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. I was like, oh man, there's masks, there's diseases. In
miserable
some ways,
stuff.
it hits too close. It's like, are you sure this is 12 years in the future? Is this tomorrow, maybe? But yeah, it feels very timely for sure.
But Keith, I know you feel this, and Shady is someone you said this, hits the sweet spot for you. And for me, any good, whether it's something that just says this is a science fiction book, or a near future mystery like this, or something that just refuses to be classified, that's set in some sort of future. Let's face it, it's a book about the present. I mean, none of us have been to the future. We can't write about the future. We don't know people's concerns. And, when you read old science fiction or old mystery set in the future, you realize, oh yeah, that's about, that's not about right now. It's about the concerns, the fears, the worries, the forms of panic, the trepidations, the dreams, it's not just negative stuff, the dreams we have for the future, the world that we can build. So yeah, this is very much a book, I lucked out with a few things that just, are happening. But yeah, this is a book about the present.
Something that stood out to me about the book was the wealthy hoarding, and for our viewers, we promise we're not going to completely spoil the entire book for you, but was that the wealthy are hoarding essentially the secret to longevity. Yeah. And I thought that was like an incredible metaphor for kind of what we are going through now in terms of, why don't we have universal health care? Why are there so many fixable issues that are faced by the common person? And the reason for that is more often than not, because those resources are hoarded by the wealthy. And I'm interested to hear you talk a bit more about that, and Keith, for you to add your thoughts as well. Yeah. I thought that was a sticky point for me there.
And hear what Shady said, fixable problems. These are, we're talking about fixable problems, even the big ones, even the most challenging ones. Yeah, the reader will find out very quickly, if within a few pages, that one of the big dystopian elements, because I said that this wasn't going to be a grim dystopia, that's true, but there are a few dystopian elements that drive the plot. And one is that this is a world where the stuff that you can read about in the paper these days, people, the billionaires and multimillionaires trying to, sort of invest in companies that are going to develop longevity treatments. How else are you going to spend your billions unless you've got enough years to spend it? Anyway, this stuff has been perfected. But you have to be staggeringly rich to afford it. So this is part of it. Now, meanwhile, a virus has hit, and it's not like COVID. It's a virus that is causing fairly rapid aging and death for many people in their 40s and 50s. So and this is an era of continued inequality, homelessness, high unemployment. And so some policy wonks have come up with the great idea that if you as a parent agree to, quote, die, when you're 65, then your children will get a modified version of this longevity treatment. You won't live forever. You'll live till, maybe, 90, 100, but you'll live in a fairly healthy way. So it's also a story about what parents will sacrifice for their kids. So this is the big dystopian element, this exit. And it's very much, I think, a reflection of just the staggering level of an increasing level of inequality. Right now, with the Biden administration pushing for a very modest increase on taxes for the wealthy, it doesn't even come close to what similar folks were paying under Ronald Reagan. Under UK, under Margaret Thatcher, the one who launched all these policies in the first place. There's been a massive shift of social wealth, and what that has meant is this sort of ceaseless reduction of taxes on the wealthy, the ceaseless reduction of taxes on corporations, the encouragement in different ways for greater financial concentration, on and on. What it has meant is that more and more resources have been taken out of the hands of the collective, out of the state, out of governments, and there's been this ideological barrage against, quote, big government. Big government meaning things that we absolutely don't need, like education and healthcare and support for old people, and and policies to develop our communities, and anyway, on and on. And so what that's meant is there's been this wholesale shift of resources, and so governments around the world are starved. They're starved for resources, and until we turn that around, we're going to have a continued problem. So that's, again, one of the big problems that the characters in this book face. But this is why I say I want to write a book that had a sense of optimism and possibility. I won't get into it. I don't get into who or what or how, but planted in the book is also a burgeoning socioeconomic movement that is building alternatives, building economic alternatives that I think can coexist, and I think in the future will coexist along with private companies and state-owned companies. That'd be cooperatives. And so I really want to build into this the sense that we can build alternatives. Here's the thing. This is a mystery. It's a classic story. There's a protagonist who is, defying the odds, risking her life, all the things that, make a book fun to read. But at the same time, I totally don't buy into this idea that one person is going to save the world. These Mission Impossible or whatever fantasies of just the heroic individual who changes everything. The world doesn't work that way. And so what I want to do is, yes, have a sense of this, incredibly courageous woman, but a real person, a person with demons. Chandler is not a superhero. Chandler, I wanted to, create a character who is like all of us, who is vulnerable, who has problems, issues, is scared of things, but also finds ways to grow, to develop, to challenge her own fears, but as part of something bigger. And that's one of the things for me that's exciting about this, is that how do we imagine a world that is different? And that's part of the fun of the book for me, is both having bits of this grim reality, but also talking about and hinting at, not through theory, not through people giving lectures on political science in the book, but just through what happens and the characters and how they talk and who they are, a sense that you and I, not just individually, but collectively, can create a different future.
Yeah, that's really terrific. And I'm excited to hear that you're working on a sequel, and it's going to give you an opportunity to draw out these ideas, especially that one. I mean, I'm sure that the sequels will have their own challenges in them, but you definitely have room in the world that you've built to really pull out the ideas. I don't know how long Jen is going to live, but you have a basis to really draw things out a significant amount and really get into the future that you want to see.
Yeah, Keith, I visualize this, or envision this probably as a 5-book series. We'll see. I don't, sometimes you read series that you love and then they go on too long. Then there's others that you just wish they would go on forever. So, you think of the Rebus series or something, I don't know. They're just like, keep them coming. But there's something built into this book, and I'll tell a little bit about it, which, again, a reader would find out pretty quickly. There's actually 2 protagonists. We've mentioned Chandler, a young DC-based police detective, but she's part of an experimental program. This is another dystopian element. She has a synthetic computer implant in her brain. And this implant is both her communications link, it's her ability to just access information at the speed of a computer. It's also there to act or to rescue her in moments of need because it's faster than her human reflexes. And here's the thing I have to tell you both that just totally surprised me. So I knew that, as I wrote this story and then eventually other books, that my protagonist, Jen Liu, would develop as a character. I didn't want to write, I didn't want her to start this book and then end whatever last in the series as the same person, because that's boring. So she's going to develop, she's going to change, she's goes through things. Here's what I didn't know. I didn't know when I started writing that my synthetic implant, nicknamed Chandler, after Raymond Chandler, of course, I didn't know that he was going to become an actual character. Until I started writing and I heard his voice instantly. But the thing that amazed me, and I mean this, I knew he was as soon as I found his voice, because he narrates about half the chapters, and then the other half are done with a third person narrator. But as soon as I started hearing his voice and he started becoming alive to me as a quote person, as a character, then he started doing the thing that characters start doing when you write a book, which is they start doing things you didn't plan. Now, writers talk about this in a woo-hoo sort of way, like the characters have a life of their own. It's just bullshit. What actually happens is, I think, unless you're a total writing genius, which I am not, I think deep down as you're writing, you get to know your characters unconsciously more than you know them consciously. You just feel them, and even though you may not have articulated it exactly who they are and how they walk through the world in every possible way, you start feeling them and sensing them. And so you might have in your outline, like I remember one novel I wrote, which is thankfully will never see the light of day. This was decades ago, but I had in my outline, there's a couple, they are separated, and this is the chapter when they get back together. So they go for a walk around the block, and by the time they get back to their house where they were living together till they split up, they were going to be back together. Guess what? They were not ready. And she was not going to budge. She was not going to get back together. And it was like mystical, but it was also like, oh yeah, I really hadn't thought through it enough. So here's what happens. I won't tell you what, I don't want to spoil anything, but Chandler starts doing things. Actually, there's one right near the beginning, doing things that he's not supposed to do. He starts developing. And so one of the themes that will be emerging in the series is nature of life in an era of growing and increasing artificial intelligence. A friend of mine who's got Parkinson's has a computer implant in his brain. And it's not a thinking implant. It's something to regulate his brain, parts of his brain to reduce the symptoms of Parkinson's. But we're going to, increasingly see things that get attached to us, both external, we externalize a lot of that right now. We have algorithms that tell us what we should be reading and watching and so forth. You don't need an algorithm to know that you should be reading The Last Exit. I mean, I'm just going to go on the record of saying that. But, so part of what I'll be able to explore in this through this character of Chandler is, and he only lives to be 5 years old. That's the ticking clock in the series. 5 books, 5 years. So we'll see what happens with him. But we'll see what happens with him in terms of his own mortality, his own development, his own, is he a he? He's an it, obviously. But they've, in this program, they've coded some of these implants as, as gender coded as a he, some as a she, some as a they. They're playing around with it.
Something I'd like to, and I know it's about time for us to enjoy an excerpt from you as well. So maybe we can also talk about this a little bit later, but I've always thought that the question of AI tends to also talk about, who or what we as humans humanize now, and it often reflects really heavily on civil rights and social justice issues. There's always kind of a linkage there, is the AI or the Android, what have you, is that a person? How far do we go to humanize this, ultimately an object that we, have humanized as it's been humanized in your story. But that said, I would love to invite you, if you'd like, to
sure
read us a little bit of the last exit for our viewers. And I'll take an opportunity really quick to remind our viewers that if you would like to ask a question of our guests tonight, you can leave it as a comment below the live stream that you're watching right now, and we'll get around to answering some of those later tonight.
Well, I'll read from the very beginning. So the lay of the land, and just to give you a sense of Chandler's voice, Chandler narrates the first chapter. So I'll just read you, a page and a half or something to get a little sense of the vibe of the book. So Tuesday, July 3rd, 8 a.m. It was only 8 in the morning, but I could already feel sweat collecting under our breasts. Jen had been kicked in the butt for switching me off for 5 minutes while on duty last week. So for the third day in a row, we were back in regulation blues, trudging along the 2-mile path circling the tidal basin. This is in Washington, D.C., right? It was boring work. Retrieve phones dropped in the water, search for kids who eluded their parents' jail guard gaze for 2 seconds, tolerate the private U.S. Park Police, help the dumber tourists figure out which one was the Jefferson Monument, keep an eye out for the saltwater crocs. This task seemed a particular waste of time since only one had been spotted so far this summer. But then again, it had eaten a jogger. When the croc was shot and sliced open, the running shoes still looked new. I was young, 2 years and 3 months. Detective Jen Liu was 38 and change. I'll be dead in 3 more years. She'll live to 100 after her mother does her duty and exits. And Jen can snag the treatment. Good for her. 8:03:52. The sun was smudged by haze that hung around like a fart under a blanket. We heard a shout by the FDR Memorial, then a scream. I tagged the time and our position. We ran. A Caucasian man who looked like he'd been stewed in scarlet food coloring was screaming at a black woman in yellow running gear. She was lying on her side, clutching her shoulder. I scanned the man and found a match. Watch out, I cautioned Jen. We ran harder. The man saw us and shot off like he had a Roman candle up his butt. We reached the prone woman, yelled, "You all right?" We got a nod and took off after the man. He was good. We were better. We tackled him at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. Nonviolence has its place, but I whacked him across the face. Jen said, "You didn't have to do that." Sure I did, and you know it. James O'Neill was his name. 27, follows the Klan in 2 neo-Nazi sites. Arrested once for battery. Dad is a timeless. So James got off. We cuffed him and I called it in. We waited for the car, handed him over, me sharing the data and timestamp with the officer's synth. We went back and called an ambulance for the jogger, although she said she was fine. Any hope we'd be rewarded with a better gig for the day crashed when I received the order to get back on patrol. Tuesday, July 3rd, 8:42, Washington, D.C. Good times.
Good times. I did love Chandler's voice, and I thought it was very distinctive. And that's challenging to do, and it's even more challenging to do when, it's not it is an entity that's not a straight up human voice. And so I thought that was fantastic. He loves to say good times.
Yeah, he loves to say good times. Okay, I just have to say, Keith, to have a poet say to a fiction writer, that's challenging to do, makes me, are you kidding? Like, writing pages is easy. Writing poetry, it's like, it's beyond comprehension for most of us. So yeah, great appreciation for your work.
Likewise.
Shady, what you were saying about AI, I think often, people hear different examples, but, examples just keep spilling out about the impact of auto, not just AI, but various forms of automation. I recently heard a Black woman being interviewed, and she was talking about how when she goes into public washrooms and waves her hand under the taps, she says half the time they don't work because the photo sensors, and just like photography has all been calibrated to skin my color, to quote white people. And she was talking about the history of photography, about how when film emulsions were first developed, and then with video, when they basically translated those standards of film emulsions into video, they took the same standards, assuming that people were going to be photographing, reflecting light off of a certain skin color, certain skin tones. And that has had all sorts of impacts in terms, if you can see anytime you watch a movie, on what you see and what you can't see well. And so, it's absolutely amazing when you start hearing about things like that and beyond, the extent to which our world gets defined for us more and more by contraptions, by the dead weight of past decisions, including decisions that may have been based on racism, on sexism. I mean, those cops I trained, I remember a woman coming up to him and said, I can't fit into, my flak jacket, my bulletproof vest because I've got breasts and they don't fit into this. We know that car safety stuff was designed for the quote average man. Well, which average was that? Actually, on and on and on. If we take that, that's just like dead equipment. If we take it into the world of artificial intelligence, then it potentially becomes really scary, because what begins to happen is that it's not only that these things are happening, but that they begin to be experienced as an extension of who we are, rather than someone telling us this is who we should be or want or enjoy.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting thing that I hope you explore in the future books. Devices and algorithms becoming who we are. Chandler and Jen, they really, they sort of develop with each other. I mean, yeah. You see a lot more of it of Chandler since he's a point of view character. But I, for one, know, as attached as I am to my phone, that if I had a computer intelligence in my head, I would get completely addicted to that. So yeah. That's, yeah. And if it were programmed with prejudices in it, of course, that would also be crazy making and yeah. would change my whole experience of reality.
And, I mean, it's actually an awful vision. I mean, part of what allows the book to work and to happen is it's just sort of, it could be presented as a total nightmare vision. I do it in a way that is, I hope, some challenge of the complexities around it, but I don't try to bring up the potential horror of it, because, let's face it, if that actually happened, that would be pretty horrible. When you think about it, when you said, if it was programmed with biases, well, of course it would be, because humans program. And by definition, we all carry our worldviews and our assumptions and our biases. They don't have to be nasty ones, but they carry, our ideas reflect our realities, what we know, what we don't know. So yeah, that could be, it could be a very different book. I didn't want to do that book, but I certainly will, by the end of the series, be diving into this. Should Jen have this delightful, he's a fun guy, but does she really want him, parked in her brain? Yeah.
That also kind of takes me back around a bit to what you were saying earlier, Michael, about sort of the amount of work that we all have, unified work that we have ahead of ourselves as a culture, as a society, working on some of these major issues, some of which are talked about in the book and some of which are just kind of surrounding the characters as a part of the history of the universe, and thinking about, as we continue to develop scientifically moving forward as a society, these questions of, well, how do you avoid or change the way that these ingrained biases reflect in our innovations? And so I would be interested to hear what you have to say about that, what both of you have to say about that, and also how it might manifest in the books. Obviously, you don't have to spoil again, yeah. But
the butler did it. Yeah, it's I think that when we talk about change, there's been that old saw: do you change society, through sort of political, social action, And by changing society, then you change individuals within that, or do you need to change individuals in order to change society? And I think the true answer is you need both. There's a dialectic between the two. When, if and when, I'm going to say when to be optimistic, because how could we live otherwise? But when police departments finally change, and not just departments, when policing changes and the laws behind them change, it's not going to be because there were a whole bunch of sensitivity training, even though I've done my share of that in my life. It's going to be because of social movements. It's going to be because of people in the streets speaking out, risking a lot, taking chances, not taking the easy route. And what happens to that? It begins to, those things have an impact. It shifts the social consensus. It gets discussion going. In the midst of Black Lives Matter, in the height of protests, you might have had two white people, arguing with each other and saying, well, I don't like, that they're in their streets, and this and that. And then, but I agree with the goals. Well, that person may not have said that, but, a year before. So social movements push politicians, they push change makers, they push companies, they push all of us. So that's one thing, but it's a dialectic back and forth because we also need policy changes. We need to create enabling environments. If you don't have healthcare, if you don't have the right to form a union, if you don't have parental days off to look after your kid after they're born, you're not going to be able to you're not going to be able to be out in the streets struggling for a different world. People organize, people get involved with movements of change, not only because there's a problem, and not only because there's a solution, but because they feel the solution is attainable. They feel that if we organize, we're going to win. And so I think it's that sense, and that's the optimism that is also in The Last Exit. It's not a naive optimism. No one says that winning is easy and there's not going to be losses, but that sense that we have the capacity collectively. So I think that, in answer to your question, it's going to take a lot of different things. I've never, in all my years of activism, I never liked it when I'd hear someone say, or maybe sometimes when I would say, oh no, we shouldn't do that thing, we should do this thing. And, step back for a second, and the answer is usually, oh, we need this thing and we need this thing. We need people organizing on the streets, and we need people running for election, and we need people doing research, and we need people coming up with new policies, and we need people, teaching in schools and raising kids with different values, on and on and on. We need all these things. And so I think that what we really need and what change is about is just encouraging each other, supporting each other. Progressive movements, have too long a history of tearing ourselves apart, saying that, Shady, I would work with you, but, I can't abide someone wearing a pinstripe shirt. It's just, it's wrong. Sorry, we can't work together. I'm being silly here, but you know what I'm getting at here. Just, trying to come up, not with 100 things you and I agree with, but the one thing we disagree. And that means we can't work together. We can't talk to each other. So we really need to build forms of unity, cohesion, and that I think leads to collective strength and to change. Now, you'd think that this is a political science book I'm writing. I just have to say that this is a fun escapist novel. It's entertaining.
So as a DC resident and a member of a DC poetry collective, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit about the choice to set the book in DC and commend you, as a reader and as a person going through my life. I'm part of the group that was very outraged in the scene in the Jack Ryan TV show where he bikes past things in the wrong, impossible order. And it's like, no, he's in Georgetown. He can't then go to the mall and then go to Dulles and the CIA. So I like that you got the DC geography right. And I was checking. So, you know, all that time researching was time well spent. But why did you choose to set it in DC? And I think it works well. But
well, thank you. That is a big compliment. I appreciate that. Because I'm not from Washington. I was born in Cleveland. I lived as a kid in Durham, North Carolina, where you can tell from my heavy accent. And as an adult, I've lived in Toronto, Canada. Set in DC, I'll tell you the main reason, but then a subsidiary reason. The book actually was sparked by a discussion I had wandering a late night wander through the streets of DC with my good friend Gary Barker, who heads this organization, Promundo, this research and organization and programming organization focused on engaging men to support really sort of gender equality and transformation and women's rights. Anyway, we had written a book together several years ago, an anti-war fable called The Afghan Vampires Book Club. It's an anti-war book. And so we were walking, it was great fun writing it together. It's crazy, by the way, trying to write fiction with someone else, but we had great fun. Anyway, we were wandering around. He said, I got this idea for a book, because there was issues, this is several years ago, in 2017, stuff on surveillance and whether, there'd been, I think there'd just been a police shooting somewhere. And so he's thinking about, maybe sort of some sort of implanted camera. So he was saying this. Anyway, we were just riffing back and forth. And, we had so much fun. And then we went away with ideas. We kept chatting. Within a month, I had gone off in one direction. He had gone off in a totally other direction. He's near finishing a literary novel that has themes around, memory and forgetting. It's the tentative titles, and then they came for the nouns. So partly it started in DC, and it just made sense to be there. Partly I've always loved Washington, D.C. I just think it's a great city. I love the feeling of it. I love, one thing that, it's all, I remember the first time I visited Washington as a Boy Scout, decades and decades ago. I was 12 years old, and just driving and seeing the monuments, it sent a chill up my spine. I couldn't unpack them and know what, they represented and say, oh, that one's to that slave owner and that one was built by slave. I wasn't there, but I certainly was awed. And, but only in more recent years, as I did my volunteer work with Promundo and hung out more and visited a lot more, did I come to just, love the vibe of the city. Just great neighborhoods, lovely restaurants. And of course, Rock Creek Park is just, one of the great, perhaps the great urban forest of the United States, perhaps the world. I mean, what a gem. So yeah, I love it. But the idea started in Washington.
Well, go ahead, Jay.
I was just going to comment that another thing that's pretty rare is when a book is set in DC, that it isn't all focused on the Capitol Hill and the political science and all of that. So I did enjoy so much that it was really an escapist sort of speculative fiction mystery adventure set in my city, my hometown. I was born here, so I had great fun with that part of it as well.
Oh, cool. And the cover, I mean, there's the one thing I'm not responsible for. I just love the color, the cover that they did. It was like, as an author, that's the one thing, one thing you have no say over. And so I've had some bad covers over the years. So I was happy about that. But yeah, it's not about, there's a bit of politics, but it's not about political intrigue per se. It's certainly there. The other thing that was a challenge to me, and I hope I did it right, was I didn't want to write in the first person of Jen. I want to represent her well. I didn't want to attempt to appropriate her voice as a woman of color. But I certainly want to do what I hope all of us can do with each other is through a lot of good listening and empathy and, just, knowing our own limits, just do our best to capture the feelings and what a character would do and not do. Although, I tell you, it never ceases to amaze me the things that one can get wrong. I had early on, like very early on, it's part of the backstory, but so it's not giving anything away. When she meets her boyfriend, she's tripped on jogging on one of the wonderful trails, in this case along the Potomac, and she ends up hopping on his bike and he drives her to the hospital. And now I knew that was fine because I knew that he was a good guy and they were going to fall in love. And she's a cop and she could protect themselves. But one of my women editors, she hit like that. She's going, "Are you nuts?" Anyway, I had to write it in. It's again one of those things you just do as a writer. You've got to listen. You've got to know that it goes back to Keith, what we were talking about in terms of biases and assumptions. You can't just, blast your way through assuming, oh yeah, I know how this woman is going to respond and what she'll do and not do. And I think, a lot of that goes back to, for those of us who are living our lives or writing from a position of relative privilege, relative entitlement, which, in my case, I enjoy. I don't say this out of some sort of, sense of birth guilt, but a reflection of the reality of my life as a man, as a guy with light skin of European background, as a straight guy, as a middle-class guy, as an educated guy, as a guy with a certain set of physical abilities. I carry with me a set of privileges that are just part of that existence. And I think years ago, I remember a woman explaining this to me and telling me about it, and I immediately started getting really guilty. I started apologizing to her, about all this privilege, and she said, "Michael, did you do something like to me today you should be apologizing for?" I said, "No." I said, "No," and she said, "I don't want you to be apologetic for something you did not do. I don't want you to feel sort of collectively guilty. I want you to feel angry. I want you to feel angry that a fellow citizen doesn't have the same basic rights and privileges that you enjoy." So this is not about, guilt. When I say, when I approached writing about having a female protagonist, it wasn't that I felt guilty that, I couldn't totally inhabit her as a human being, because, there's really, as writers, there's one person we can, as anyone, there's one person we can totally inhabit as a human being. It's ourselves. Well, that'd be a pretty boring book. So we do have to use our imagination. We do have to project. We do have to empathize. But we also have to listen. We have to listen if we're going to learn. And we have to listen and not just say, yeah, but just take it in. Take in those criticisms. Take in those concerns. Take in that pushback. Take in that challenge. And I think right now in the United States, I would say this: if people with, if white people, and that's a race category, the assumption that somehow, that's a racial package. But people with my color skin, if we're not listening and listening intently and intensely, we're making a big mistake. We are letting down our fellow citizens and we're letting down ourselves. And that's part of this journey of change. And that's one reason why I like fiction. I like writing fiction, because it allows us to put ourselves as a reader into other people's lives, that we can imagine ourselves within a story. We can dream. We're taking part. We open a book. You walk into Lost City and you open any of the fiction that's there, and suddenly you're in a different world. And it may be a happy world, it may be a sad world, but you're in a different world. And so you become part of this collective dream. And that's why we need fiction. That's why it's fun to write. That's why I love reading it. That's why I can't wait to see Shady Rose's first novel that she was telling me about one of these days, because it is about that collective dream that we all need. And that's also, Keith, I know you've got another collection coming out this year. and it's partly what poetry distills in such a, I mean, distills is the only word, in just so few words, that sense of experience and the world and dreams and nightmares. We need more of that. We all need more of that right now.
Definitely. Yeah, and one of the things I love about the DC Poetry Collective and our books, here, get my book on the screen for a hot second, is that we do have different viewpoints. In each author has their own editorial freedom. So it's so important with literature as a whole, and it's just a wonderful thing as writers that we get to try to bring into the world.
Yeah.
And you can pretend the poetry's harder. I'm still impressed that you finished a novel, and Shady, when you finish yours, I'm going to be impressed too. I'm going to be like, oh my god. But yeah.
So we have a few more moments here, and I'd like to invite our viewers again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can leave it as a comment below. But a few thoughts that I have about The Last Exit and about how it's going to go forward into a series. I'm interested in some of the other world development moves that you're thinking of making, or things that are tumbling around in your head about developing this world that you've created for The Last Exit and the future books.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I certainly thought about some of the themes, because I'm thinking about plots and what will be fun and interesting, but also challenges that we face. There's, I won't tell you more, but there's the first sequel has two big themes. One is violence against women, and one is big oil and gas. Yeah. So it'll be, in terms of themes, those are the next two on deck. Hopefully around a year from now, that will come out. We'll see. In terms of this world, I think it's a really good question, and it's one that I'm still grappling with. This first sequel takes place just about 4 months after this first one ends. So there's not sort of big world developments yet. But it's part of one of the things, and I'm glad you raised that, because it's one of the things that sort of I'm pushing myself to think about, okay, what happens in this world over the course of the books? Are there things that are getting worse? What things might be getting better? Where do we see possibility? Why, if things are getting better, why? And how do the people of 20, 33, 34, 35, 36, how do they pull it off? What do they do right that we can learn from and start sooner than they did? So yeah, I want that sense of, this isn't like far in the future science fiction. It's pretty grounded in today with a few differences. But it is about our world. It really is. And I was curious, Shady, when you said, if I could ask a question back, you said this sort of, in terms of genres or genre blending, this sort of hit a sweet spot for you. I'm curious what you meant by that, because I'm not looking for a compliment. I'm just looking what you see as that sweet spot, how you articulate that.
Yeah, certainly. For me, what I like to read, what really impacts me strongly, is a piece of fiction that's, as you said, grounded in today, grounded in reality. A piece of fiction that I can see the society I live in reflected in, while also speculating on the future, either through a little bit of science fiction or other types of speculative fiction, and using those devices to examine the society and examine the culture that we are in right now. So, for example, another good example is if you've read Ted Chiang, his books of short stories, either The Story of Your Life or Exhalation. Those are both really great books of short stories that are on the surface, yes, science fiction stories, but it's very much about the humanity of the characters, or the humanity of the characters, even if they're not humans, and things like that. So
Yeah.
It's definitely just about, for me, that sweet spot is well written characters that I can relate to, with that little element of speculative world building or speculative fiction surrounding it, that gives it a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for? An outside view, an outside lens on what is happening right now. So if we wrote
Right.
a straight story that says, oh, the world's burning, but I don't know, and everybody's really sad about it, that's
Yeah.
that's real. But I want to
Yeah.
see, I want there to be a device that examines it from completely outside of my lived experience.
Right.
I think that's what The Last Exit does. That's what a lot of the books that I read are able to do.
Yeah, cool. Now, if someone in not only in Washington but beyond wanted to buy The Last Exit as a Mother's Day or Father's Day present, I just thought I would just throw this out to you, because people got to come to you, right?
Absolutely. To our viewers, if you are interested, after hearing all these wonderful things, in purchasing The Last Exit, you can find it at Lost City Books. We're located on 18th Street in Adams Morgan. We've got a few copies left, although this one's coming home with me, so you can't have this one. But yeah, come on and check us out. We also do still have some copies of DC Poetry Collective's Ink Blots Volume 1. This has been a really great conversation. I'll give our viewers one last opportunity to ask any questions. If you all would like to give us a few closing remarks about this book, about your experience with this conversation, I would be very grateful.
Great. Well, it's been fun. One of the things that struck me as I've done several of these bookstore events is how quickly we got into politics, and in a nice way, in an organic way. And I think that reflects our time, doesn't it? It doesn't just reflect me or the book, but it affects this moment that we're going through. This is even though it's totally different from the late 60s, early 70s, the 60s, where just, everything, whether it was discussion, movies, music, I mean, everything was about the youth movement, the student movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, anti-war movement, the beginning of the gay and lesbian rights movements, beginning of the environmental movements. I mean, yes, the 60s were different, but one of the things I think we're going to look back and see that this is a moment of incredible, the birth of a lot of change. And it doesn't make it easy. The change is not one way. There's huge pushback, as we know. But I've been really intrigued by the discussions I've had since the book came out in January now, a few months. It's been really gratifying. It's both those types of discussions, and then at the other end, a website like popsugar.com sort of names it, one of the fourth on their list of the top books of the year, which seems a bit premature since the year is only a few months in, but I'll take it. So it's a daunting process, coming out with a book. Thousands and thousands of books come out a year. So you just, it's events like this and having independent bookstores that actually have human beings and not just algorithms that, you can walk in to Lost City and say, I liked this author. Can you recommend another book I might like? Or you can phone in and do that. So, this is part of building alternatives, and they're diverse, but yeah, that's, I've joked a few times about, go buy the book, go support your library and take it out of the library. I'm not trying to sell books, actually. Shady's trying to sell books. But this has been a lot of fun. And I love that we've had this three-way conversation. I love that I'm talking to other writers. You can see, when we got gushy about each other, here's one of the things that might surprise some people. The writing community, by and large, is an incredibly supportive community. You go to, there are these wonderful mystery writers conferences, several different ones a year, for example, and people are just so supportive of each other, of other writers. Yes, people want, writers want to claw the eyes out of the writers, whose books sell 1 million copies a year. But besides that, no, seriously, everyone is so supportive. And it's one of the wonderful things about being a writer, that we're part of a community. And this is, indie bookstores are a celebration of this. A discussion like this on Zoom and Facebook is a celebration of this. And I just want to thank not just Lost City for hosting this, Keith for throwing his weight and poetry behind this and as part of the discussion, but for the people who are tuning in or tune in to the recorded version of this. Just thanks. Thanks for being part of this. Thanks for being part of this collective mystery that is about reading. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And speaking of indie bookstores, my last line here is that tomorrow is Indie Bookstore Day. So if you're looking and jonesing for a copy of The Last Exit, or you're looking to stock up on books, tomorrow is a great day to do so. Come on down to the store. Again, we're on 18th Street in Adams Morgan. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. And thank you to our viewers for being a part of another really great release of a book. I really recommend it. Come and grab it. Read it once and twice, and I can't wait for the next book in the series. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and say our goodbyes by getting us up here.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Yeah.